I want to get some more right now in our top story, the legal saga over the fate of a Maryland man mistakenly deported to El Salvador. The White House doubling down right now on its refusal to bring Kilmar Abrego Garcia back to the United States, despite a U.S. Supreme Court order to, quote, facilitate his return to the U.S. while also not infringing on the president's ability to conduct foreign affairs. Let's get some serious analysis right now from the former U.S. District Court Judge Shira Scheindlin. Judge Scheindlin, thanks so much for joining us. Here's what President Trump said about this case on Friday. Listen to this.
If the Supreme Court said bring somebody back, I would do that. I respect the Supreme Court.
President Trump is now saying something very, very different. Is he defying a court order?
Well, he certainly isn't facilitating the return of Abrego Garcia, and that's what the court order requires him to do. I can't find any act he's taken that facilitates that return. I hear narrow construction that facilitate means, oh, I'll send an airplane if they want to let him go, and they, El Salvador, doesn't seem to want to let him go. But I think that's disingenuous at best. The president of the United States has a lot of power. El Salvador is a little country. The president could say to the president of El Salvador, I want this guy back. And that would be the end of it. Then he'd be on a plane and then he'd be returned. So I think the judge today is going to be very stern and is going to say to the lawyers for the government, what have you done to facilitate the return? And they're not going to have an answer. They're going to say, we can't get into foreign policy. That's foreign policy. And I don't believe that for a moment.
Right, that they're seizing on what was also in the Supreme Court opinion about the president having the ability to conduct foreign affairs and how the district court judge should really factor that in the decision. But the bottom line here, right, is that the White House says Abrego Garcia is under the control of El Salvador. The Salvadoran president says he has no power to release him. So who determines this man's fate?
Oh, I don't think the El Salvador president doesn't think he has the power to do it. The El Salvador president said, I won't send this terrorist back. I think he does have the power, but I think he's made the decision that the man is a member of MS-13 or of the I can't say it right, but the other terrorist group.
Right.
Thank you. But the fact is there's no proof at all. There's no evidence at all that he's a member of either. So that seems to be just another excuse. The U.S. has said, we made an error in sending this man out because there had been an order called withholding of removal, which means he can be removed. But he was. So we've admitted an error. We're not telling El Salvador to do it, and we should be. And of course, the El Salvador president has the power to do it if he wants to. But I think he thinks he's working with President Trump to not return this man. So yes, I see it as defiance, and I think the judge will see it as defiance. Then the question is, what can the judge do about it? Is she going to consider contempt proceedings? If she does, and if she holds the government in contempt, that brings it back to the Supreme Court, because there would be an appeal to the Fourth Circuit, then there would be the Supreme Court, and we'd hear from them again as to what's going to happen here.
As you know, Judge Scheindlin, the Trump administration is claiming that the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling only meant they had to remove, quote, domestic obstacles, not that they had to work with the government of El Salvador to try to bring Abrego Garcia home. They seem to be taking advantage of the court's vague language about, quote, facilitating his return. Do you think that argument will hold up?
I don't. I think they're trying to spin it favorable to the government. Each side here has claimed a victory, which is kind of interesting, but a 9-0 decision that brought every member of the court together, to me, is very clear. It means he didn't get due process, he has to be returned, and you have to facilitate that return. So I do think that the judge, as I said, will have very little patience for the government's position and will consider what can she do about it? What can the court do? Is she really without power?
Last night, which shows that now the majority of Americans now disapprove of Trump on the deportations, 53-42.
Okay.
So I think that is a big deal.
Okay.
Well, because they think he's administratively wrong, because they think they're taking people who are not criminals out of the country.
I've just been so disappointed.
But this is a real case of squandering, right? There was some agreement with Trump,
Right.
but not for this. And I think that's a really important point here, right?
Yeah.
That there was, and we saw this even in the polls leading up to the election, right? They were they were okay with some of this, but not this kind of radical behavior. And that's what we're seeing.
Yeah,
I agree.
I hope that Americans see the value in caring about this and these videos that they made of these hundreds of men who were chained and sent out of this country and put into a notorious mega prison in El Salvador. I hope that they can connect with it. I just, we will see, and maybe those numbers bear that out. From politics back to the law. Danny, where does this go next?
I think this road could be leading to contempt. And what I also think, and I don't know that any federal judge will be candid about it, but I think there are a lot of federal judges who don't want this to go down the road of contempt, because that raises a really thorny issue of who do you hold in contempt in the chain of command? Because every human being in the administration's chain of command can say, I was ordered to do it, except one person. And that person is at the top of the chain of command. So if you're a judge, whether it's a Supreme Court or a district court judge, and you find that someone has acted in contempt in this administration and their reading of the order is wrong, who do you punish? That may be the next tricky constitutional issue.
We've got a lot going on here. I want to start with this, though, Danny. Complicating matters is that Abrego Garcia, the mistaken, and I use that word lightly, I put that in quotes because aren't they all these deportations that have happened to this El Salvador prison legally questionable? But in terms of this mistaken deportation, it's not clear how the U.S. Supreme Court would have jurisdiction. Points made by Secretary of State Marco Rubio yesterday. Take a look.
I don't understand what the confusion is. This individual is a citizen of El Salvador. He was illegally in the United States and was returned to his country. That's where you deport people, back to their country of origin, except for Venezuela that wasn't refusing to take people back, or places like that. I can tell you this, Mr. President. No, the foreign policy of the United States is conducted by the President of the United States, not by a court. And no court in the United States has a right to conduct the foreign policy of the United States. It's that simple. End of story.
So, you know, there's been a lot of criticism of the Supreme Court, the way they phrased their decision, and you predicted how everything would go down on Friday. And at the same time, this is difficult, isn't it? And the Supreme Court may have done all they can do. You have an El Salvador resident return to El Salvador, and a judge in Washington, D.C. telling El Salvador to send back one of their own residents to the United States. It's more complicated than it looks, which Marco Rubio is pointing out that, look, what's the deal, guys? Politically, we'll get to the politics of this. This is a winner for the Trump administration, in my opinion. And then on top of it, distracting from all the other questionable deportations. Can you comment on the Secretary of State's explanation of this?
The Secretary of State's explanation, like much of the Trump administration's position, all was predictable. And as you mentioned, I was here on Friday and I read the Supreme Court's order, and anyone reading it could have seen this coming. I would love to be some talented fortune teller.
Right.
I'm not. If you just read the language of the Supreme Court order, that order said, and I'm quoting from it, that any directive the lower court came up with would have to give due regard to the executive branch's exclusive authorities over foreign affairs. The Supreme Court essentially said to the lower court, go back, tell the administration how to facilitate this return if you dare, or if you can find a way to make the administration do it. The administration knew that from reading the language. They could just sit back and say, hey, we've done everything we can. And their position is, we view the word facilitate as removing all domestic obstacles. So if he happened to make it back here to Cleveland, we would have no problem taking him. But now that he's in El Salvador, there is nothing we can do because, as Rubio said, this is infringing on the area, the exclusive executive area of foreign affairs. And just one little footnote here, too. There's been much reporting, and correctly, that the government admitted this was a mistake. But keep in mind, that will not be the administration's party line, because the attorney for the government who said that. The administration has essentially disavowed this person. They put him on administrative leave. For not zealously representing the government. Pam Bondi's words, not mine. So, while it's true the government admitted that Garcia was removed improperly due to an administrative error, don't expect the administration to carry on with that position. They've already distanced themselves from it. They don't believe they're disregarding a court order. They believe they're acting consistent with it.
Absolutely. And Dave Arenberg, you had the president with the president of El Salvador right there going, nope, I'm not going to send him back. And the president's job, you tell me, in terms of trying to follow the U.S. Supreme Court ruling, President Trump's job is done because he sat right next to the president of El Salvador and said, I'm not sending him back. Therefore, any attempt to facilitate his return ends with the president of El Salvador, does it not?
Well, that's what they're trying to say, Mika, but it's obvious that President Bukele would have this individual on the next flight home in first class if Trump demanded it. Judge Zinnes was right, the district court judge. You don't rid yourself of constitutional responsibilities of due process by outsourcing your detention. And we're actually paying El Salvador to lock these folks up. And Kristi Noem, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, said this is a tool in our toolkit. So if it is one of our tools, we can fix the problem. I don't think we're in a constitutional...
Donald Trump continues to lose at the Supreme Court. The question is, like, what's going to be done about it? Because he's making threats to judges. And he's acting very much like, remember how Trump put up the picture of Andrew Jackson? I'm going to delve into history here a little bit. This is not my expertise with my PhD in history. I study post-war Canadian history, but, I got a bit of a knowledge on this. And when Trump put up the picture of Andrew Jackson in his first term, not only is he infamous for his treatment of indigenous people, but there was a specific moment where he just ignored the Supreme Court. He violated, and governments at the time violated the rights of indigenous people, like the Cherokee, right? And they went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they won, basically suggesting that their treaty rights are real and that they should be respected, and that the government made a deal and they should keep it. This is why Gorsuch, wrong so often, has been pretty solid on indigenous rights, because he views it as a contract issue. The United States made contracts with the indigenous nations, the reservations and whatnot, the Indian countries, the capital I Indian communities, and they should be honored. But what Jackson did was still do the Trail of Tears and still deport, effectively, force them in a death march, thousands of people, tens of thousands, and many died. And basically what he told the Supreme Court was, you and what army? And this is what we're seeing with Trump. Because Trump is like, the Supreme Court could pass any ruling it wants. The Supreme Court does not have an army. Does not have an independent army of the president. And so we are entering a dark period where Trump continues to lose the Supreme Court, but he might just ignore it.